So the idea is we'll run through what the personal statement is, as well as how to lay it out and things. I'm just going to make sure that we are recording. Yes, good. So what it is, how it's laid out, and just some strategies of how to approach it and things you can do. So the process is really important. All of you thinking of applying for medicine, I'm sure are aware of your timeline that UCAS sends you, and you know how to write, you know, when it's due. October the 15th is your deadline, all these sorts of things. I would say on the whole, ignore a lot of this. So like this says that you can write the first draft of your personal statement maybe a month before. You absolutely could do that, but I know lots of people in medicine are thinking about it a lot before that. And you know, evidence of the fact is there's 30 of you guys thinking about it towards the end of June. But it's really important now to be thinking about what needs to go into it. And are there any gaps in your understanding that you need to be thinking about now? Are there anything that you're missing? And we'll talk about some of those things tonight. But is there any sort of do you have a good example of leadership? Do you have a good example of this and that? You can really kind of know that when you come to write it, you're not going to have any gaps you kind of want to focus in on. Because it's a long process. You need to make sure that you've got time to get fed up of it. You know, you'll write this piece of paper and you'll go back to it again and again and again and again, and you'll get fed up of reading it, honestly. You know, you'll have seen the same line and sentence and changed the wording here and there a million times. And it's just giving yourself time to go away and come back with fresh eyes, to send it to people. You know, if you've ever had to send anything to a teacher to have a look at, or a tutor, they take a while sometimes. It's making sure you've got time for them to have a look through and give you good feedback, to give it to lots of people and get lots of good feedback, which is why we wanted to talk about it now, even though it's kind of in the distant future. It's something to have in the back of your mind, because if you do need to put things in place, they need to happen now. You know, you can't be a month before your application and be thinking, oh, I need an example of leadership, I need to join a team to show teamwork, I need to do some teaching or anything like that. Perfect. Sorry, I keep having to click admit. So why bother about the personal statement? Well, it's the only bit of your application that you have some control over in terms of how it looks and how it reads. Your UCAT score, your BMAT score is just a score, and that's all they see. They don't see the hours of work that you put into it. Whereas for the personal statement, they will see exactly what you submit. And so therefore, it's kind of a nice way of selling your story that you otherwise wouldn't get to do before normally you go to the interview. They get an idea of your personality before you go. Cool.
So in terms of the, sorry, yes, as Travis was saying, it's really important that it's an opportunity for you to shine. So one of the biggest things about the personal statement is, as Travis said, it's the one thing that they have before they get to see you at interview. And also it's the one way that you can really stand out. And this is a place where universities use it in different manners. And we're going to go through that, how different universities use it. We're also happy if you want to post in the chat if there's any particular university you want to ask about. So me and Travis, between us, will be answering any questions on there. And we've got some Q&As at the end. So to start off with preparation, the most important thing that you need to start with is make sure that you've structured it out. So you need to have a good, strong structure to start with. And we're going to go through some different strategies that you can use to have that structure. In terms of starting off, what we think you should do, and we'd recommend doing this from today, is basically make a list of things that you want to discuss. And that's things that you can talk about in the general layout. So you want to be able to go through, write down what you might mention in your introduction. So a few key points. So an example being, my interest in medicine stemmed from a work experience placement, or a terminally ill, or a particular event led me to wanting to do medicine, and this is what happened. But equally, it's important to remember that most people haven't had a sudden event or a sudden epiphany that's led to something happening or starting. So it is fine to just say, I want to do medicine because of this. You don't actually have to have a key striking event that's led you to want to do it. The next thing we want to talk about is academic experience. So you want to say, you want to show off how you've achieved something. Everybody who applies is going to have A levels. Most of you are going to have relatively good GCSEs. So it's difficult to use those things. However, things you can use is anything additional that you've done, which is academic. So some of you may have done an additional GCSE. A particular example for myself, I did ICT at A level. Instead of doing it in 2 years, I did it in 1 year. So that was something I mentioned. You might have an interesting extended project. It might be something that you've then gone and presented at a certain university, sorry, or a certain college, or to a certain group of students. So that's something which can be really interesting, especially if it's not related to medicine. That's sometimes very interesting. In terms of work experience and the layout, it's really important that you talk about not just what you've done, but what you've learned from it. And Travis is going to talk about this later on today. So we're going to talk about how you can reflect. And that's one of the biggest things that we see at interview and in personal statements. So a lot of people always say, I conducted my work experience at X, Y, Z, and I saw how doctors work together in multidisciplinary teams. However, that in itself is good, but to make that exemplary and outstanding, you have to then fill it up and say, as a result of this, I've then done X, Y, and Z and seen X, Y, and Z. And that shows how you haven't only seen that skill, but how you've gone and applied and used that skill in something of your own choice. And that could be an extracurricular activity. So for example, you could say, having seen how doctors work together in teams, you went and volunteered to be the leader of your Duke of Edinburgh course, or you were doing something in a sports team. As part of that, you wanted to make a challenge, you set up a team B, or you did something outside the normal realms of that team. And then the end bit, which is very important, is the closing statement. You want to make sure there's a strong punchline at the end. Well, I say punchline, but it's almost I really want to do medicine. I really hope you'll consider me and you'll take me, without writing those exact words. It needs to be a nice summary, which is really sucking them in. And again, we'll go through ways you can do that. So that's the general layout bit done. In terms of the main topics, so we've gone over this briefly, but the ins and outs are very important. So you want to, this is one of the models that we use, and we've used it for coaching for many years, and it kind of touches on all the topics you want to try and mention in your personal statement. And you could almost use this as a bit of a checklist, although it's not fully comprehensive, but it contains most of the stuff that you should include. And these are some of the things which, if you're missing skill sets, these are things you can go and do in the next few weeks before your application. So the first thing is, what inspired you to want to do medicine? It might just be that it was watching a TV program, it might be a family event that occurred, or actually it might just be that you were always interested in different sciences, or you want to go into dentistry, medicine, or you've got someone in your family. But what is it that's personal to you that made you want to do medicine? And is there an inspiration behind it? So it's important to start with that, and in your introduction, have a bit of an overview. And it also, whilst doing that, it's important to show that you understand some of the roles of a doctor. So in your personal statement, you need to be able to say, so this links in with the experience of the role. You'd say, I've seen doctors working together doing X, Y, and Z. Or you need to say, I've had this particular experience, and as a result of it, I've understood that doctors can be working under high pressure situations. They have to step up and they have to show leadership skills. You might have seen a doctor who's really stressed out, and actually that's quite common as well. And it's not necessarily negative. Quite some of the most startling personal statements we've read, one of them was where somebody had written about a doctor who was really upset. And it was very unique, and actually it makes you remember the person. So they'd reflect about how they'd seen a very upset doctor in a stressful situation. But because that's a bit unusual, it actually shows insight, and it shows that you genuinely know that it's not all cushy and an easy ride. It can be quite challenging, and it is quite difficult, particularly at the start. In terms of once you've demonstrated these roles, what you need to do is be able to talk about the specific skill sets that you have. And that's where the following things that we've mentioned below that come in. So you can talk about your extracurricular activities. Commonly, people have done sporting activities, people have done music activities, charities, volunteering, and these are certain things that you can try and top up at the moment. So for example, as Travis mentioned earlier, if you haven't done anything relating to leadership, or if you haven't been involved in anything leading to teamwork, now's a good time. You can try and set up a small group of friends. You can volunteer for Good Samaritans. There's little things that you can do to try and give you that edge and fill in any gaps. We're also going to come on to journals and other things which can really make you stand out. The other thing to mention is any additional qualifications, your adaptability and motivation. And as part of the adaptability and motivation, you have to show where you've tried to go above and beyond. And a lot of that does come across in the interview as well. However, in your personal statement, you can mention about things you've done, difficult situations you might have been on, and how you've addressed them. And that's where reflection is extremely important. And Travis will be coming on to that a bit later on. So we'll be moving on to that in a second. In terms of the general structuring to realise and the important facts, so the personal statement is 4,000 characters, essentially works out to be about 47 lines, about a page of A4, a bit more. And what's really important is that you have to make every word count. Initially, it can be quite hard to fill. So when people start off, we've already been coaching some people and they don't know what to write. And that's why the checklist is really good. But what happens after a few drafts is that you realize that there's so much more stuff that you want to include. And then it becomes about making it concise, making it reflective, and making it tick those points. Obviously, there can't be any mistakes. And that's what the whole process is about. You'll go through it, you'll see many, many drafts. It gets very boring and repetitive towards the end. But that's where it comes in, where you'll stop noticing certain mistakes you've made because you've read it so many times. And that's where you need to get different people to read it. In terms of what they do, when you submit your personal statement to UCAS, some of you might have heard of Turnitin. They use a similar software which is used for coursework or university assignments. And what it does is it flags up if you've got any sentences or if there's any statements in your personal statement which are very similar to other previously submitted or currently submitted personal statements. If it's more than 10%, they then basically flag up your personal statement to your tutor, and they'll flag it up to the university and to yourself to say that this has happened and they've got concerns. It's quite rare that it happens, but equally it is very easy to do. And actually, if you think about it, a lot of the statements are very generic. So, most people say, I really enjoy biology and chemistry and maths, or I really enjoy working in a part of a team. And that's where you have to be very distinctive and say, actually, having done this experience, I've then enjoyed working in a team. And as a result, I was inspired to go and form my own team, form a charity. Or as a result, I did a fundraiser in which I was able to go and feed the homeless or raise money for a hospital or hospice and those kind of things. And that's where you'll really stand out. But that was the main common kind of things that happen. The important facts. What we're going to go on to now is the common mistakes that people make. And in terms of these common mistakes, these are things which are adapted from university feedback. So we've contacted quite a few different universities and we've summarized these points in terms of what they say that's almost too waffly. So to start off with, the first problem or the first thing that universities identify and pick up on is they're too descriptive. So a lot of personal statements will just say, I saw X, Y, and Z, or I appreciate that a doctor has got leadership skills, management skills, but they don't actually then go on to demonstrate how they've used those and reflect on them. So we're going to talk about how to do that. The other thing is they can be quite general. So again, you want to see what specifically was it about the situation you noticed. So where the personal statement where we'd had somebody who'd seen an upset doctor, they'd written about how the communication was very challenging, how they'd witnessed the doctor breaking bad news. There were awkward silences in the room. There was a lot of tension in the room. There was a nurse present who had a box of tissues. But it's very, very personalized and you can almost feel the atmosphere. So it's important to try and be specific where you can. The other thing is you need to be quite selective about the words you use. And that's where the too romantic thing comes in. So there's an example there, but words like enlightened, privileged, they're all a bit too vague and a bit too romantic. So you want to try and avoid those words. And the other thing is a lack of structure. So that's why we've mentioned the structure we went through earlier, because you want to make sure that you've got a good beginning, middle, and end. And it's almost a story that you're telling. So you're talking about how you were sucked into medicine, the experiences you've had, what you've seen, and how you've got that skill set, which makes you the person that they want to be their doctor. At the end of the day, what tutors are looking for is someone who they think is a nice, humble person. And actually they're showing that whilst being a humble person, they're demonstrating that they've got the skill set that's needed to be a doctor. In terms of name dropping, this is a common thing that's done. So people might say that I worked with Dr. X, Y, or Z. You have to realize because these tutors are scattered around the country in different areas of the different unis and different parts of England, Wales, Ireland. They're also not all from a medical background. And that's why sometimes personal statements are sent to lay panel members. So if you've name dropped a particular hospital or a particular doctor who might be famous, they might not have a clue about who it is. And also it can very rarely happen that actually it might be that the person reading your statement doesn't like that person's research, or there's a contrast there. So you have to be really careful, and we wouldn't advise name dropping. And that's something which medical schools have actually highlighted to us as well, that they don't like it if there's any name dropping. So they're the common mistakes to avoid. In terms of the actual layout and the paragraph layout, so the first bit needs to be, we've called it the punchline, but essentially what we mean by that, it's the first few sentences which are telling us who you are and what's inspired you to do medicine. So just an example, my journey to medicine began when I was introduced to, or when I first saw X, Y, Z happen. You want to be able to say, this is what's really inspired me to do medicine. Common examples I say, so one of the things I used was please save my baby. And you just think, what a random thing. And then at the end of my personal statement, I spoke about how that's what a mother had talked about. And that was one of the experiences I reflected on in the personal statement. You want something which is punchy if possible, but equally you want something which best describes something about you and your motivation to do medicine. Then you want to be able to go through what your understanding of the roles of a doctor are. So you want to talk about what a doctor's done and what your roles are. I'm just also looking at the chat, and I've noticed Travis being quite busy talking through it, but hopefully we'll talk on some of those things. So your understanding is about demonstrating what you've seen. And there's a lot of different buzzwords which are really, really important. In terms of the way you can show your understanding is by using some of the right language and linguistics that doctors use. So leadership and management is a buzzword, communication skills, interprofessional skills or interpersonal skills, working with different professionals, multidisciplinary teams, that's very important. So basically it's quite important by multidisciplinary teams, what you'll see, and it's a bit harder to see at the moment due to the COVID situation. A lot of this is happening virtually, or actually it's harder to see this, but commonly there's in certain areas in hospitals, you have weekly MDTs, multidisciplinary team, and what happens is you'll have a physio, you might have an OT, you might have a radiologist, you might have a social worker trying to plan how to get someone home, and then you'll have different types of doctors. So you might have an oncologist, a cancer specialist who's giving their input on something. You might have a care of the elderly doctor. And it's about how you've seen that and witnessed that. And then you want to try and sell what's unique about you. So what we read really commonly is where people have again said that I play the violin, for example. What you want to say is what inspired you to play the violin, and what was it that you took the extra step to try and learn. So an example for myself, which I've used in my academic dermatology interviews, is I've been doing Taekwondo for a few years now. When I first started off with Taekwondo, I found it quite challenging. However, as I've progressed, I've now gone on to a level where I've reached deputy black belt within 2 years. The additional bit about that is, one, it's almost a cliffhanger because it makes the person think, how long is it meant to take? And that's an interesting question for the interview. So you have to remember, a lot of the ones where you talk about something in your personal statement, it also becomes an interesting topic for your interview. But it's also something which is unique. And the uniqueness is about mentioning what you've done and how it's different from what others might have done. So for example, the deputy black belt bit is interesting because not everyone does it in 2 years. Some people need to take longer, some people take private lessons. And it's an interesting topic to discuss. And there you can then talk about your skill set. So for example, having progressed to Taekwondo, I've been able to support junior students. I've done a lot more development. It's been harder for me as an older student. I say older student, I'm in my 20s, but a lot of the people in Taekwondo classes are a lot younger. So you want to be able to talk about lots of different skill sets that you have, which are quite transferable to medicine. And the other thing is about your achievements and your suitability to do medicine. So when you're demonstrating you're doing these things, what you're trying to say is that I will make a good doctor because I have done these things. So that's really, really important. So you want to be able to say that these are skills that a doctor needs, and these are things that I have done and demonstrated. So as part of my St. John's work experience, I have gone and worked as a part of a team. Whilst working as part of a team, somebody was really unwell. I was able to then take lead on managing this patient. I then filled out all the paperwork. I reassured my colleagues that everything was under control. And that's something which was a high pressure situation, something which I hadn't been in before. But actually, I feel this is something that I've worked on, and in the future, I feel like I will be under high stress situations as a doctor. So it's about having that insight and actually showing how you've done what you've seen and what the skills that you need to have to be a doctor. So
Excellent.
in terms of the next bit, I'll hand you over to Travis, who will talk about some of the general strategies.
Before I go into that, I did say in the chat, I'm just going to answer some of the questions because we're going to leave them to the end, but I think we'll probably spend another hour trying to answer the questions if I leave them to the end. And some of them are going to require me to write a lot, whereas I can say it a lot quicker. So the last question that I stopped answering was somebody was asking about how many, so people were asking about the system that Sharon was talking about. So the system that UCAS uses is very specific to them, because effectively they've got everybody's personal statement that was ever submitted to them, and they just check them. The one that he compared it to is called Turnitin, and that's something that some colleges use, all universities use it. And basically, if you submit an essay, it tells you how likely it is that that's similar to something else. There isn't something that you can use to check, but obviously you know if you've put anything that you've copied into your presentations or into your personal statement. And if you're not sure whether or not you've made a note of something and then copied it into a personal statement, thinking that because you've handwritten it from a website, it's your writing, the easiest thing to do is just copy it into Google. And if Google flags it up, you know that you need to reword something. How many examples do you recommend to use for each section of the plan? It really depends on the strength of the example. Sometimes you can say there were these 3 experiences on my work experience which summarize the feelings of the doctor during the day. Sometimes you can say there was this one situation, this one thing happened, and that highlighted to me exactly. It all depends on the experiences you've had. What can we do now to stand out? So this was the question where I thought, now I need to stop typing and start actually talking. It depends what you've done, in all honesty, but think about the qualities of a doctor that you need to portray. So things like leadership, teaching, the emotions of medicine, and have you experienced those? Have you had to care for people? Have you had to, what's a time when something went wrong for you? Have you put yourself out there and experienced all these things? And if you haven't, think about how you could. So, could you, as COVID now is starting to close down, could you talk to some of the care homes, or even could you start looking at volunteering in a hospital again, or could you do some research or some writing on a topic? Could you look at doing some research into something that really interests you? Could you do some teaching, even if it's over Zoom? Could you do some local teaching for GCSE students or students younger than you who are interested in medicine? All those sorts of things. What would be the best way to say that you're inspired to do medicine through learning the sciences paired with caring nature without it sounding too cliche or common? This is really common. Ultimately, that is what it comes to. Science, medicine, science and people in science, caring in science, and you just want to put them together and make a statement out of it that doesn't sound like the other 10,000 applicants that are applying that year. Ultimately, you want to try and tell your story. So everybody has come to this conclusion that they want a job that is science and medicine. However, you've come to that conclusion for a different reason than me, for a different reason than Sharon, from a different reason than everybody else in this webinar. And so it's about highlighting your story rather than just, saying that you wanted that. Why did you come to that conclusion? What happened? And sometimes you're not sure, and it takes somebody to talk it through with you and break that exactly down. What's your YouTube channel called? Medic Admissions. But I will say at the moment there's nothing on there while we're still doing some of the editing. Is desire too romantic? It depends on the sentence and the context that you've got it in. Sometimes it can sound a bit cliche and romantic. Sometimes in the context of what you're saying, it doesn't. I think it does lean on that romantic side there, if I'm being honest. So being too descriptive and too general are a little contradictory, and it's hard to find the middle ground. I totally agree with you. Ultimately, it's because you've got this one page. And when you do your first and second and third draft of your personal statement, you'll find that everything you want to put in takes about 3 pages. And it's really, really, trying to condense it down. And that's what we mean, is you need to get the absolute details in. And, none of the fluffy stuff. It's just concise reflection. What did you learn? And ultimately, how will you get that right? It's just drafting and redrafting and redrafting. In the beginning, you want to get words on the page. You want to make sure that you've got enough time to kind of just get everything down. And then it's about going through and pulling stuff out and what makes the best example, what tells the best story, that sort of thing. Do you need to include the names of the hospitals that you did work experience in? It depends. If you did all of it in one place, maybe. I would certainly be like, if I was redrafting somebody's essay and I wanted to make sure that they got all the detail in, it'd be things like that that came out first though. And that was where, when I'm meeting a consultation with my personal, how do I tell the background of it without being too descriptive? So it depends. You know, you need to set, we'll talk about how to reflect in a moment. You still need to set the scene because otherwise it doesn't have the impact. But you don't need to say, you know, while on the Thursday of my work experience at the Hillingdon Hospital, I was in a clinic with a forensic pathologist, and they, you know, you can just say, well, work with a forensic pathologist in clinic, and then you've got the same thing, but much, much shorter. I'm a bit worried that everything that I've done is quite generic and not specially unique. Don't worry, ultimately, like, you need to make sure you tick the right boxes, but outside of that, everybody is the same. You know, there will be a few people who have done special things, but I've interviewed for Imperial for 5 years, and I've seen people do open university degrees extra. I've seen people do like operating theatre live. I've seen people with like surgical experience. I saw somebody once who flew out to Africa and had worked with African children as like a volunteer. And yes, they sound amazing, but ultimately 9,800 other people have done exactly the same. They've done their A-levels, they've got some work experience, they've, you know, done some extracurricular stuff. They're not looking for you to be the #1 candidate. They're looking for you to know what medicine entails so that you don't drop out. They're looking for you to have shown some dedication to medicine, to be academically very, you know, very good, and to have an extracurricular portfolio that shows that you're a well-rounded individual. And ultimately, that's what you're looking for.
Whilst Travis goes through a few more questions, I'll quickly do 2 or 3 more slides. So these might cover some of the questions in terms of general strategies. It's important to have a structure. And the reason we mentioned having a structure is it's quite easy to bounce back and forth from different things. So commonly what we see in statements, particularly at the start when you've written your first draft, is people tend to mention work experience at the start, then it might come in again at the end, and the skills are scattered everywhere. And that's why we say it's important to follow a structure. In terms of the redrafting multiple times, we think that's extremely important. So what happens is that in terms of when you're in the first draft, it's going to be very waffly, and it's about making it concise. And as time goes on, you go through a checklist, you find out more things you've done. And actually it might be between now and by the time you submit your personal statement, we'll be guiding you on other things that you should try and do. And it's about having those things in your personal statement. And the other thing about having multiple drafts, it's important that you send it to different people. So ideally you want to have a doctor who's had work experience and personal statements, and you want to have an experienced tutor. Usually at schools and colleges, the teachers you will have, they're very good at helping people in terms of language, structure, layout, grammar. However, they don't usually have a lot of experience in terms of reading a lot of personal statements that have been successful. So commonly teachers, it depends on which school or sixth form that you're in, but some sixth forms might only have 10 personal statements a year or 10 people applying a year. And that means that there's a bit more limited experience. Whereas actually, if you can find a doctor, someone who interviews, or someone with an insight, you can then get someone who can give you a lot of feedback. But that's why it's important to have lots of different drafts and be selective about when you send them to people. So you don't want to send a grammatically weak personal statement right at the start to someone who's a valuable resource. You'd probably want to, unless they've helped you draft the statement from the start, you probably want to save that person till a bit later on. But equally, you want to make sure that you've included all the right content. The other thing is that you want to make sure you've got the different types of reviewers. So you need the teachers, parents, somebody with their grammatical background, language background, to make sure that it all makes sense and it all flows. But equally, you need somebody to be a bit analytical and a bit technical and be able to point through things and say, actually, you've mentioned this here, but you've not reflected on it, or you've mentioned this here, but you've not shown how you've done a particular thing to make yourself stand out. In terms of uniqueness, it's important that you do talk about what you've done, which is unique. So for example, one of the questions was about painting. So in painting, you can say that it's a hobby that you enjoy in your spare time. It's something which you find it helps you manage stress quite well. It might be that actually you do it as a hobby, during exam time, it might be the one thing that helps you switch off. It might be that you're quite creative. It might be that you've made paintings for fundraisers, or equally, it might just be something which you just find really, really relaxing as something that you do. And sometimes you pick up on these things in interview and you say, oh, we read about, you've written about painting. Tell us what it is that's really struck you, or tell us about your favorite painting or something that's inspired you. And it's a good topic to talk about. So don't be shy to mention those things. It's important that you probably do mention those things. So these are the generic and general strategies. In terms of the specific tricks that we're going to tell you, these are things that you can try and do to really make yourself stand out. And this is what we go through in our coaching, what we've done over the past few years. This is where you guys can really stand out compared to a lot of peers. So the first thing we've written is about the incomplete appeal. The incomplete appeal is like the example I gave about Taekwondo. You almost give enough information to make someone interested, but you don't give the full story. And this could be what you're doing in terms of your actual hobbies. So for example, in the painting situation, you could say, recently I've been painting. It started off as a hobby. However, as I developed this skill, I arranged some fundraisers. And it might be that actually you want to talk more about it. You haven't got any other areas where you've ticked off the charitable work or voluntary work or extracurricular experience. But it might be that actually then leaving it there, it becomes a good topic for interview. And the interviewer will ask you, oh, tell us about your fundraisers, or tell us about something you've done. And that's almost the incomplete appeal. We've called it that on purpose. The other thing is about journals. So this is something which only a few people usually use, but it's a really good thing, and it does make people stand up. So one of the things you can do and start doing from now is just keeping an eye out for any interest or articles that you might find really interesting. So one journal in particular which is good is the New Scientist. There's a student BMJ. There's other journals that you can read online. There's podcasts. And just name dropping, that's one place that name dropping can be quite good. So for example, one of the things that I've mentioned in my interview recently for dermatology was, I recently read an article on artificial intelligence, and I found this really interesting. And going forward, it's a model which may play an important part in dermatology, because what might happen is that you get automatic recognition of lesions. So you might be able to see something, and then from there you can diagnose what it is, and the machine might be able to do that for you. But just mentioning that you've read something interesting, again, it makes it that incomplete appeal. You've got something in the interview, they'll be like, oh, that's interesting. And it shows their academic background, because as a doctor, when you're even studying as a student and throughout your life as a doctor, you will get given a lot of research papers, or you will come across a lot of different things. And it's about being analytical, being able to sift through a lot of data and knowing what's scientifically correct. But also just having a bit of generalizability and readability. So if you've written about something, it looks quite good, even if it's a one-liner saying, I read about artificial intelligence, it was something interesting, and this inspired me to then go and do my EPQ. Or as a result of a journal article, I went and researched this particular topic. In terms of, somebody's asked about a recommendation of journals, so New Scientist is a good one. Student BMJ's one. You could use Nature. There's also podcasts. I think Travis is about to write something, or he'll mention it in a second. And the other thing I wanted to mention about these specific tricks is a multitude of skills. So it's really important that you've mentioned what specific skills it is that you have. And it's about showing that you've got that full package. And that's why we say that when you're going through the structure, it's important that if you haven't got a particular skill, now's the time to get it. And now's the time. You've got a few weeks before, you've got a few months before your application's due. So you can really push that and make sure that you've ticked those boxes so it stands out.
Excellent.
And I'm going to hand over to Travis now, and he's going to go through reflection.
Excellent. It'd be quite nice for Sharon to have to do some typing. Honestly, the questions are great. It was great to actually try and keep up and go through everything, and to have you guys thinking along the right lines already is really good, because you're kind of thinking, is this the way to do it? Is this the way to go through it? Can this work? Can that work? And hopefully, like somebody was saying, I don't really have any hobbies that I can use. I can't, I just go to the gym and things like that. I don't really have something that fits in like Taekwondo that Sharon was talking about. I was like, well, actually, things like that are perfect. It's just how you frame them, because I was saying, the gym teaches you focus and dedication. You have to keep going. It shows that you're promoting health, etc., those sorts of things. So it's just all about how you frame these things. So when you come to writing a personal statement, and when you come to your interview as well, it's all about how you reflect on situations. Like you just saw, it's all about how you frame it. One person can take the one situation and make it sound really good. Another person can take the same situation and not sell it quite as well. So make sure you choose your right examples. When you're thinking of an example of leadership or teamwork or experiencing medicine or MDT or anything like that, it's about making sure you use the right example. So is it relevant? Is it complex enough? You don't want to sound simple, If they say, give me an example of a time that you had to show leadership, and you say that, I helped everybody one day guide them from the classroom outside. It doesn't really quite sell it, that sort of thing. So it needs to be complex enough to show that you overcome lots of problems. And does it have the right impact? So, you know, did it grow your personality, your insight, your growth? You know, did it lead to big results? So that when you kind of sell the punchline, it shows that you really did stuff from it. Cool. So there's a framework, and you'll hear about this with lots of people. Lots of people talk about the STAR framework. I've added an extra R and an extra S. And actually, I've kind of added another letter as we go. But if I put that in, it doesn't spell stars anymore. So, but this is a really common framework, not just for medicine, but for all walks of life, and actually all types of things. So, set the scene. What's the situation that you were in? You know, what situation were you faced with? And then, so for example, in the first year of college or when working as a healthcare assistant, that's all I would say. You know, you don't need, you know, while at this hospital on this day at this time, etc. What did you have to do? What was the task? And why were you asked to do it? So go through that in kind of some detail. Then what action did you do? So you've got your task, but what did you do? And then what was your reasoning? So this is the extra letter. I couldn't put a, you know, what was your reasoning for that action? So you might say that while I was a HCA or while I was working at a care home, I saw a patient or I saw a person crying, and I wanted to go and comfort them. And so I approached them slowly, and you know, you can kind of detail exactly why you went through all these kind of steps and what you did. And then what was the result? So by sitting down and talking to this person and understanding why they're upset, I was able to calm them down, and I was able to talk them through that things aren't so bad, and you know, just give it some context. And can you quantify this? Is like, you know, and I know I like to think I made a difference on that day, because actually when I go back to the care home, the resident always smiles, and we always have a cup of tea and talk through things. You know, it just shows that you made that difference. And then reflecting on it. So what did you do well? So, you know, I feel like on that day I was able to communicate what I wanted appropriately, or you know, while working as a part of a team, I was able to delegate tasks, but also work as part of the team, etc. What didn't go well? So, you know, be honest and say, you know, I feel like I could have done this better. And, you know, especially when it comes to interview, it's really common to be asked, you know, what mistakes you've made or when things have gone wrong or what feedback you've had. How did it make you feel? Medical schools are really big on how you kind of feel, because there's this whole, especially at the moment, there's this whole thing about resilience and well-being of doctors and burnout. And so you need to make sure that you're highlighting, you know, how did it make you feel? If it made you feel uncomfortable, what did you do about it? If it taught you something about how you're going to feel as a doctor, how did you think about that? You know, and this all influences your idea. This works really well when you're talking about your experiences of medicine and like your work experience, because ultimately the only reason that medical schools want you to do work experience is so that you don't drop out. That's all it comes to. They don't want you to get down the line, be faced with patients, faced with emotion, faced with things that are quite, you know, difficult to deal with, and then go, actually, I don't think this job is for me. Because at that point, they've invested lots of time and lots of money into you that they could have invested in someone else. And that's all it comes down to. They want you to get enough of an idea to know what the role of a doctor is so that you stick with it. And then strengthen. So this is the idea of what could you have done differently? So, you know, what did you achieve or what could you have done differently? Those sorts of things. Just to really finish off and strengthen it so you don't finish on the reflection. So here's a really good example. And in a personal statement, you might have to cut this down, but I put the full thing here. So, you know, I was the captain of the cricket team. I wanted to lead them to best of my ability so we could win the cup. To do this, I remained approachable. I delegated tasks. I organized travel. I adapted communication to get the best out of people. I was commended for this, and we won the cup. It allowed me to develop my pressure and decision making. And then by doing this work experience, I've seen how critical leadership is, and I know that'll apply to medicine. So it's a really nice like snapshot of how it works. And with certain examples, it can seem very long, but actually what I would say is that once you've got it all written out, you can then cut it down, but it's good to make sure you don't miss any section as you're going through. Perfect. And so this is just some top tips from some of the UK universities, just so you get an idea of what they themselves have said. So I'll let Sharon go through these while I try and answer some questions on what I've just been talking about.
Yeah, so we've had quite a lot of questions. And again, it's great to see you guys asking all these questions. We love the interaction. And we commonly get asked these questions. They're very common questions. Just to phase out a bit, so somebody asked about gap years. In terms of gap years, I myself did a gap year. So I didn't get into medicine initially, and I was in a similar situation where whilst writing my personal statement, I almost had to write what my plans were. And actually, some of those plans weren't even set in stone at that point because I wasn't sure what I'm going to do. So I'd written about my plan on being able to do some volunteering abroad. So I ended up going to India and doing some volunteering there. So I wrote about how I was going to go to India. I was going to try and work in a charitable hospital there. The other thing I wrote about was I'd started a job over the summer in B&Q. Again, that was quite generic, but then by the time I got to the interview, I was able to talk about how whilst working in B&Q, I was working as part of a team. I then got promoted onto the kitchen and bathroom section because I was good with communicating, good with customers. So they wanted to have me on the design side. So again, anything which is generic or you're not too sure about, you can still mention it. And definitely, Pavan, you should talk about any international experiences that you've had. So a lot of people haven't had any international experience, but one of the things you can do, especially if you have had experience abroad, which is what I did, I compared and contrasted the experience that I had in terms of the NHS and how medicine was abroad. So I talked about working in a charitable hospital in India where they had limited resources, people were quite poor, and actually medicine there was very different. It was very paternalistic, whereas medicine here is very holistic. It's a lot more joint decision making between the patient and the doctor, and actually resources in emergency care, a lot of it's free. So things like that which you can mention, which is really good. In terms of top tips from university, just go back to the presentation. So the best statements that we mentioned are ones where you've reflected essentially, and where you've got proof that you've not only seen and witnessed the skills and you know the skills, it's about reflecting and giving insight on how you've used those skills, and that's what's really important. And the same thing, you want to be able to show what your interests are, what your experience is. And commonly we tend to remember certain statements where somebody said something which stands out, and that again is a common thing. And if you've got something unique, or you might have mentioned something quite generic, but you've then gone and mentioned something unique later on in your statement, we'll remember you for that. And even at interviews, sometimes you'll read a personal statement and suddenly it'll be, oh, I'm going to highlight this and ask them about what this is, or ask them a bit more about it. So it's important to have that. And again, the other thing is not to worry. So this is the statement at the bottom of Manchester. A lot, and this is from recent in the past few weeks, a lot of people won't have had a lot of work experience, and many students may have had no work experience. And medical schools this year are particularly aware of that and conscious of that. So don't panic. There is also a blog on our website where you can have a look at things you can do to try and top up and supplement your work experience. That's quite a good way of doing things. But one of the things you can do is, if something's been cancelled that you had arranged, is just email them back or write a letter to say thank you so much. I appreciate it must be a difficult time that you're going through during this COVID pandemic. And equally say, if there's anything else, if there's any other opportunity in the future, please let us know. And equally, you can even talk about in your personal statement where, due to COVID, something got cancelled, but you're now in the process of rearranging something if possible. So that's quite good to mention if you can. But they're essentially some of the top tips from the universities that we've had, and it's quite important to try and focus it in terms of where you're applying as well. In terms of making it powerful and stand out, so again, it's about making it personalized, which we've spoken about. It's about using buzzwords. So we mentioned MDT, which is a multidisciplinary team. We've mentioned communication. There's other ones like interprofessional education, where you've seen members of the multidisciplinary team working together, and leadership skills, management skills, seeing the structure, the layout of the NHS. You could talk about resource allocation and those kind of things. And again, the skill set, you want to demonstrate the application of what you're saying. So as a result of leadership skills that I gained, I was able to do this, or as a result of working in a team, I was then nominated to be the leader to take on this task. It's about taking it one step further and saying what you've done. The other thing is about exploring opportunities, the interview appeal. So we've mentioned that in there because you want to show where 2 people or 5 people might have the same opportunity. So 10, for example, if you look at it in a bunch of college students, there might be 10 different students who've done an extended project. But what is it that makes you different? And what is it that makes your extended project stand out? So you can talk about my example was spinocerebellar ataxia. So I came across a patient with spinocerebellar ataxia, which is very rare. It's 1 in a million patients have it. I was fortunate enough to understand the experience that the patient had and get insight into their day-to-day life. As a result, I then went to do a research project, or I then did my extended project, which looked into this. So it's about looking at where there's opportunities to, one, add in medicine, and secondly, to add in that you've got that extra spark, that academic spark, and that thing that's inspired you to do something related to medicine. And then the last bit was about having that conclusive appeal, about having the striking statement. At the end of your personal statement, what commonly happens is that admissions tutors, for example, you might have 3,000 applicants to a university, and even if they're just reading your personal statement at the interview, for most medical schools, that might be 1,000 personal statements that they're having to read. So commonly, they might even skim through it. They might skim through the introduction, skim through the middle and the end. And that's where it comes in about having the striking statement. You want to have things in there which, if possible, they're a bit different. But again, it's about showing what you've done, which makes you stand out. And again, the painting example is a really good one, because you might turn around and think, actually, it's quite a generic thing. But actually, just from doing painting, you can really talk about how it's helped you de-stress, it keeps you motivated, you've done fundraisers and lots of different things. So it's just writing things that are specific and make you stand out to have that striking statement. And the other thing we're going to move on to is about know how it's used. So it's important to know how medical schools use your personal statement. And the reason being is that you want to tailor your personal statement without actually mentioning. So you can't mention in your personal statement, I'm applying to Bristol Medical School because of this, because then you're screwing over all your options. But what you can do is you can look at what things they want and talk about what things you've done which make you a really good candidate for them to want. So for example, if you look at Cardiff, their criteria says that they'll look at your personal statement and they'll look at your referee's report. That's extremely important, and Travis is going to talk about that a bit later. But what they also want to see is evidence of self-directed learning. And that's something which most people might not include. Most people might not mention that some of you may have done an extra GCSE, or some of you may do some extra academic tutoring or something that you do outside your time, but you might not have mentioned it. But just because you've read that, you might realize actually there's a point for having statement. So you've actually gone through the full application guidance and gone through it, so you know exactly what things that they want. So you want to make sure that you've got you've read all the application admissions criteria for everywhere you're applying, and you tick all the categories needed for the personal statement. And sometimes they might not actually have it under the personal statement section. It might be that you've gone onto their website and they've then written something under work experience, or written something under skills required to do medicine, or skills required to be a doctor. And then you can go through those bits and tick what you like. So that's quite interesting as well.
Excellent. Cool. So yeah, I just wanted to touch on references, and then I'll come back to the questions that I haven't quite got to answering. So just a note on your reference. So people forget that they spend all this time writing their personal statement, and you forget that somebody in your application is going to also basically submit another personal statement, which is your reference. And so you can really forget about this. And when I sit down as an interviewer, I basically have these two documents next to each other, so we kind of see them both. Because of that, I would say that make sure the right person writes your reference, especially if you're doing medicine and you're coming from a school or a background that typically don't like put people forward for medicine. They might not know exactly what you want in it or how to phrase it, and sometimes it's worth seeing if there's somebody else, so maybe the head teacher, the head of sixth form, rather than like a careers person that is writing your reference. And then try and know what they talk about. Ideally, you want to get a copy of it. Some schools do get a bit funny about you asking for a copy of your reference, but ultimately, if you're applying for medicine, we're hoping that you've got a good reference, and so they shouldn't be, even if they don't want to give you an actual copy, they should at least tell you the headlines, because what you don't want to do is get to the interview and then them ask you about something and you can't remember it or you can't answer it because they've picked on something like a book club that you did, or an activity that they remember you doing at school, but you can't remember the details yourself, and it just makes you look unprepared. So I think that's just something to be aware of, that I've seen lots of people get caught out with their reference. Perfect. Okay, okay. So just to go through a few of the questions that Sharon was trying to answer, or that I didn't answer. Um, Perfect. So do you need lots of different hobbies? You don't need lots of different hobbies. And I certainly wouldn't like start a new hobby just for your medical application. But actually, like what you'll find is you already do lots of things. And it's just how you frame them, you know, whether it's that you read for stress relief or you like spending time with your family because you like to have that support network around you. There's lots of ways of framing what you're already doing to tie in. You just don't think about doing them for that reason, if that makes sense. And so that's where having someone who's done lots of personal statements can really help, because it's actually just about how you frame things and how you tell your story. Um, Again, somebody was asking about should we talk about our A levels, and it's all about, you don't want to talk about them at length, but actually you could be doing different A levels to someone else, and therefore you need to explain why you chose to do this A level and they chose to do that A level, because that all feeds into your story, because you've made hundreds of thousands of decisions that led you to applying for medicine and to do these A levels and have this experience to apply for this job. And that's what you need to get across, really, is that why did all those things come together? What did you do to improve confidence? Speaking, teaching, you know, speaking in public helps a lot. Explaining yourself, breaking down how decisions work, reflecting back on it. In terms of interviews and offers, when we do our interview preparation later on in the year, I will happily go into excruciating depth about, you know, how to interview well, how to speak, how to break down, you know, how to leave cliffhangers in statements so that you prompt people to ask you the questions that you want to be asked, and all these sorts of things. But interviews are a long way off. So we will come back to that when we can. Perfect. Okie dokie. So just to finish off, I just wanted to mention this. Now, the way that we kind of do medical admissions is that we run everything on the whole for free. We never like what we're offering, we never hide behind paywalls or anything like that. But we know that some people need a little bit more help and want a little bit more help. So we try and put a few things in place just to kind of help out where we think it can. And this was something that we ran in a few schools last year that was really useful, that people really liked, where we basically came to the school for a day, we sat there, we drafted the personal statements, and they could just basically keep submitting drafts to us. So in one day, you can have like 10 revisions of your personal statement. And so this was something that we thought we would offer out, where we're basically going to have a day where we'll kind of go through how we would structure a personal statement in the morning. And then throughout the day, we'll kind of break down the different paragraphs, and you guys can just write. And while you're writing, we will give you feedback. So we can jump onto Zoom as a one-to-one and talk about that paragraph, break it down, give you feedback. You can go back, write a bit more, come back, talk about it again. And it'll be really small groups with only doctors. So it's going to be like one doctor to about 5 students. So it's really, really focused. So for a little amount of money, hopefully you get a whole day with a doctor. And we've had to like bring in some of our doctors that we know who have interviewed for different medical schools, just so that we've got enough people to kind of cover this for the day. But hopefully, you know, if you are happy with your personal statement, that's fine. But hopefully if people think, oh, I need a little bit more help or a little bit more support with my personal statement, it's a way of getting lots of feedback very quickly, and in one day getting kind of a full draft together, which is kind of what we thought would be useful. So if it's something that interests you, by all means, I've popped a link in the chat. Feel free to sign up. As I say, there's only sort of a few places, just because we want to keep the numbers low so we can give everybody feedback. And there's only Sharon and I and a couple of other doctors who are involved. And we want to make sure the people who are coming are actually, one, doctors, two, experienced interviewers, and also just aren't people that we pull in out of medical school or off the street, like a lot of companies do. So if it's something that interests you, sign up. This doesn't change the webinars that we're doing and stuff like that. And then next week, we're going to be doing our UCAT webinar, just like we've done one before, and we're going to be going through like specific questions and things. But again, if people now they started thinking about UCAT preparation, they're looking for a course, I have to promote our own course just because we think it's the best one around. And so again, if you're interested, let us know. We can get you signed up for the 12th of July. Otherwise, I think, although we've put some questions here, the only one that we haven't really answered as we've gone through is, will you write it for me? Which the answer is no. Please, 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 please don't pay someone to write your personal statement for you. ultimately it just won't sell your story. I think in 5 years, I've definitely seen 2 or 3 that we didn't think the candidate had written themselves, and they always do really badly because you can't justify your decisions the way that you can personally, and you're much better off just spending the time actually going through. Perfect. So does anybody else have any other questions now that we've kind of finished going through everything, either just on general applications or on specifically the personal statement? So is there going to be another BMAT webinar? Absolutely. So because the September one's been cancelled, later on in the year, we're kind of going to focus on UCAT for a little while because that's quite soon. And then we'll kind of come back to BMAT. I've done a peer reading program at my old school, not my new one. Can I still talk about it? Absolutely. It doesn't matter where you did the thing. Yeah, you're going to do your work experience in hospitals and care homes all over the place. It's not what you do, it's what you learn from what you do, basically. How should we start our first draft? So, as I say, if you come along in the day, you'll get a good first draft done. But effectively, what I would say is don't start with that first paragraph because that's the hardest by far, your introduction. Start somewhere else and then come back to it. Let me have a read where Sharon jumps in.
So for the BMAT, somebody's asked what the latest date is. So at the moment, as you're aware, the September sitting has been cancelled. So if you're going for the November BMAT sitting, the deadline is 15th of October. That's the latest you can register. A lot of people have also asked if we'd recommend doing the BMAT or whether we'd say avoiding it. From most of the students we've been coaching this year, most of them are actually, some of them wanted to apply to Oxford initially, but many have actually been put off from applying because the early sitting is gone. So what that means is that you won't know your BMAT score prior to applying. So your application will be submitted. And people are being quite risk averse because, and we were talking about this ourselves a few days ago, if we were in the same situation, we'd probably be reluctant unless we really, really wanted to go to a particular university, because it's almost like submitting a blind application, having done a test that can be quite difficult and requires a lot of preparation. But we always advise, particularly for UCAT and BMAT, that ideally you want to have your score, your breakdown before you apply, and then you can accordingly target your applications to those particular universities where you think you've got a strong chance of getting in.
Excellent. So can we pick what day we set our BMAT and UCAT? So you can pick what day you set your UCAT. The BMAT is an exam like a GCSE exam that you have to do at an exam centre. So we talked about last week, if your college itself doesn't run the BMAT, you need to find somewhere that does. And effectively, you end up having to go there and paying them to let you sit the exam there. But that's a very set date, like your GCSE exams. UCAT, you can pick. Cool. So can we use
leadership examples? Yep, 100%. So I'd use any leadership examples. And again, it's about showing what it was that you did which made you stand out. So talk about the example that you have and talk about what you did, what your role was, and try and link it in with how you then saw doctors working together or somebody you've seen in a leadership role.
Excellent. And then we've got, do you think you can, this year you can mention something due to COVID or lockdown, what you've done during the time? It really depends. So there's been lots of stuff. Some people have come out and said, you shouldn't mention coronavirus at all. Other people have said you should really focus on it. I think everybody's situation is different. And so if there's a story to tell that leads to your application from the coronavirus, then tell it, because that leads to why you want to apply to medicine. So, you know, if by doing it, you're allowed to do a little bit more research and you say you can how you turned around the pandemic to help you learn more, I think that's worth putting in. But just to say that it was a hard time for you and that sort of thing, I think I would avoid that style of, you know, if you were going to say that I showed resilience through the lockdown, I think everybody had to go through it, so it doesn't necessarily show why you're unique. So it depends on your situation and your stories. And we're happy to talk about specific things if that is useful to people. Can you give an example of how to add a cliffhanger? So with your personal statement, it's not so much for cliffhangers. I think you kind of need to explain your examples, but inevitably you won't be able to put enough detail in because you just have those 4,000 words. So that's where you can expand out. When I was talking about cliffhangers, I was talking about in your interview. So when we talk about interview prep, a really good thing to do is to lead someone to ask you a follow-up question. So you can say that, you know, while working in the hospital and being in the operating theatre, it really inspired me. And, you know, the things I saw were really eye-opening. And then you lead them to ask you, or what did you see? Yeah, and then you get to talk a little bit more. Perfect.
Ideas for what you can do in lockdown to show skill. So some of the things you can do at the moment is, again, read some articles. So there's the journals we mentioned earlier, Student BMJ, New Scientist, Nature. It just shows a bit of interest. You can also sign up as students for certain societies for free. So it's worth having a look, for example, Royal College of Physicians. There's medical society you can sign up for. The other things you can do, there's stuff like Good Samaritans. You could do a fundraiser. You can even volunteer, help out your schools or colleges by even producing something simple like some signs for social distancing. You could do learning resources. You can say you designed a leaflet which you posted at your local church, museum, or somewhere, just to help educate people on a particular topic, something that might be useful. Or you could just do a fundraiser. There's lots of things you can do, but it's about just making sure you show what you've learned from what you've done. And again, going to that checklist to make sure you've covered lots of different things, to make sure you've shown that you've got a strong skill set overall.
Excellent. Kind of start with intro, comparing how the UK and poorer country, potentially, if that's something that, like you say, leads into your story. It's all about how you kind of phrase those sorts of things. How can you promote, so locally, local fundraising, look at like business fundraising as well. So like places like the Co-op have like local support for fundraising. Local newspapers are very good at having a fundraising section, that sort of thing. So they're all the sort of things that I would, like in terms of fundraising, different ways of accessing it. Perfect. Thank you to everyone who's already signed up. I'm just watching my email inbox fill up with people who have signed up for the hackathon. So thank you very much. If you are interested, I'm looking forward to seeing you all on the 3rd of August and actually really going through and getting these personal statements done. But no, thank you very much for those. If anybody else has any other questions, whether it's about medicine, that, you know, the whole idea of Medic Admissions is we create this community of people that want to apply for medicine and are the right people to apply for medicine, ultimately because you guys are going to be the people that we work with in 5-10 years time. And so for me, it's kind of an investment in my future and in Sharon's future, because we're going to bring the best doctors through to kind of be our junior doctors and work with us. So that's kind of where we've started Medic Admissions from. And it's great to see so many people so engaged in medicine and wanting to, you know, go through. So for those of you who are interested, we will see you next week for our UCAT questions webinar. And then the week after, we're doing our insight into medicine and kind of a day in our lives. It's great to see, I'll be seeing a few of you I can see already signing up for the personal statement hackathon. So that'll be a really good day of going through that. So I look forward to seeing some of you then. But otherwise, I hope everybody has a lovely evening. And as I say, if there's any questions that we couldn't quite get to, because I can see them still firing in, do let us know, and we'll happily answer them either on Instagram or by email. You can always email us just at either Travis or Sharon at medicadmissions.co.uk. I'll just pop in there. And as I say, I look forward to seeing you, whether it's at the hackathon, at a webinar, or any of the events we're coming up soon, or just chatting on Instagram. But thank you for coming this evening. We really appreciate it.
Brilliant. Hope you'll have a nice evening. Just a few final answers. Should I mention fundraising for hospital ward? Yes, definitely. That's something you can mention. You can mention how it's helped the ward and the skills that you gained from it, working in a team, organising it. In terms of, what was the other one? Primary school, you can mention something you've done, but again, make sure it has to really stand out. You can mention something you've done at a primary school, but unless it was a national or international achievement, it might not be worth mentioning in your personal statement. You only want to mention it if it makes you stand out, because it was a long time ago. Other than that, I know we've had a lot of people sign up, but if anyone's got any questions, just message us, email us, Instagram us, and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. I hope you all have a nice evening.
Perfect. Take care. Bye.